Last time we spoke about the 800 heroes who defended the Siang warehouse. In the Fall of Shanghai during October of 1937, amidst overwhelming odds, a small battalion under Colonel Shi Jinyuan took a stand inside the Siang warehouse, transforming it into a fortress against the invading Japanese army. As word spread of their stand, local citizens rallied, providing vital supplies and cheers of encouragement from across the Sujo Creek. The defenders, dubbed the 800 heroes, symbolized hope and determination. Despite suffering heavy casualties, they held firm, embodying the spirit of resistance against aggression. As dawn broke November the 1st, a strategic retreat was ordered, allowing Shi's remaining troops to escape safely into the international settlement. Their legacy endured, highlighting the courage of those who fought against overwhelming odds. The saga of the 800 heroes became a beacon of hope for future generations, immortalizing their determination to protect their homeland during one of its darkest hours. This episode is The Battle of Shanghai Part 7, The Fall of Shanghai. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still longing for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we're about to release a new mini-series following the Philippines campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 28 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The fall of the Siang warehouse and the withdrawal from Hongjo Bay and Zhangwan doomed the Chinese defenses in Shanghai. The army shifted to a fortified defensive line along the southern bank of the Sujo Creek, extending north towards the city of Nanchang. Sujo Creek provided an advantageous defensive position, acting as a natural barrier measuring up to 150 feet wide, with steep banks rising 7 feet on either side. However, once this line was abandoned, there would be no fallback position remaining. Losing control of the Sujo Creek would be the loss of Shanghai. As German advisor Borchardt noted, the Chinese command was therefore putting all of its efforts into holding the position for as long as possible, without risking the annihilation of units crucial for continuing the war. The Japanese planned their main assault directly south across the Sujo Creek to encircle the troops stationed in Shanghai. However, they first needed to create sufficient space for maneuvering. To achieve this and to secure the right flank, they launched a significant attack on Nanchang on October the 28th, advancing along the railway from Shanghai. With the benefit of extensive support from aircraft and artillery, the Japanese were able to breach the Chinese front line with relative ease. Nevertheless, they failed to capture Nanchang, and the outcome was less of a victory than initially it appeared, as the Chinese had established a robust defense, preparing a 2-mile stretch of obstacles and barriers east of the city. In a subsequent advance that shifted to the south, the Japanese engaged in a brief battle before seizing the town of Jianru, which was strategically important due to its radio station that facilitated much of Shanghai's telephone and telegraphic communications with the outside world. In preparation for crossing the Sujo Creek, the Japanese had spent several days assembling a small fleet of vessels commandeered from Shanghai's civilian population, which included motorboats, saipans, and basic bamboo barges. On October the 31st, the 3rd Japanese Infantry Division, positioned at the eastern end of the Sujo Creek, initiated several crossings. During one of these attacks in late afternoon near the village of Jiaojiachao, Japanese soldiers managed to reach the southern bank, but were immediately met with infighting fire from Chinese machine guns, resulting in significant casualties. They also faced counterattacks from Chinese reserves, who had been quickly summoned to neutralize the threat. Despite these challenges, the Japanese were able to maintain a narrow foothold. A parallel attempt by the same division further downstream, closer to the international settlement, ended in failure, despite the evident superiority of Japanese equipment. Engineers deployed a mile-long smoke screen across the creek, while a dozen 3-engine bombers protected by fighter planes hovered over the battlefield, actively scouting for targets. Although a small landing party successfully crossed the creek, they were quickly met with a fierce artillery barrage and a Chinese counterattack forcing them back into the water. Foreign military observers speculated that this operation was more of a reconnaissance mission than a serious attempt to cross in that sector, as engaging in a battle so close to the international settlement would have required operations in heavily built-up areas. On November the 1st, 3 battalions of the 9th Japanese Division attacked in small boats across the Sujo Creek at one point where the Chinese front line bent northwards, successfully establishing a bridgehead on the other side. Over the next 2 days, the division managed to deploy a substantial number of troops across, eventually controlling an area that stretched for about half a mile along the southern bank of the creek. The following day, the Chinese launched a determined effort to eliminate the growing threat. While they made significant gains, they ultimately failed to eradicate the Japanese landing party, partly due to their inability to fully utilize their considerable artillery resources. At the beginning of the day's battle, just 60 feet separated the trenches of the opposing forces, meaning any barrage aimed at the Japanese was likely to hit the Chinese as well. At dawn on November the 3rd, the exhausted Tax Police Division was taking horrible losses trying to hold the Japanese back. Men began to scream poison gas as white clouds drifted across the Sujo Creek towards their trenches. Despite this, the Japanese had not managed to carve out a bridgehead, but did build a pontoon bridge and sent a small force over to occupy a 2-story building near the bank, designated as the Red House. Hongjo, the commander of the Tax Police Division, was a nervous wreck, feeling overwhelmed by fatalism after Chiang Kai-shek threatened to court-martial any officer who permitted the Japanese to cross the southern bank of the creek. The appearance of an ominous cloud was the final straw. Although the cloud was later confirmed to just be a smokescreen and not poisonous gas, Hongjo was already defeated. With another Japanese assault imminent, he felt incapable of leading the defense. "It's over. It's all over," was something he said at the time, raising his sidearm to his temple. Nearby, senior staff officer Sun Li-ren intervened, urging him, "General, please go back. We'll take care of this." The battle continued until 4 p.m., but the battalion that faced the brunt of the Japanese onslaught had disintegrated. Its commander was dead, along with all but one company commander and over half of the platoon commanders. Of the original 600 men, only 200 remained. This was not what the Tax Police Division had anticipated when they were pulled out from the area south of Worsened Creek the previous month. They believed the strong defenses at Dachang could hold for at least a month or two, providing sufficient time for the exhausted troops in the rear to recover. On the evening of November the 3rd, following the latest Japanese attempt to cross the creek, the Tax Police Division's commander ordered Sun Li-ren to rest. However, Sun felt the need to complete one last task, that being destroying the pontoon bridge the Japanese had constructed across the Sujo Creek, which remained largely intact despite repeated Chinese efforts to demolish it. Previous attempts included frontal attacks and sending swimmers downstream with explosives, but it all failed. Finally, they prepared a large roll of cotton soaked in gasoline to roll downhill towards the bridge, but these efforts were halted by Japanese barbed wire. For his final attempt, Sun requisitioned sea mines to float them downstream and detonate them near the bridge. To ensure the success of this plan, he required the cooperation of some engineers. Unfortunately, the engineers he ordered for the last-minute mission had not been trained by him, and despite being of lower rank, they were disinclined to put in extra effort for the unfamiliar officer. They worked slowly, and by dawn, the mines had yet to be pushed into the water. In the early morning light, they became quite visible targets along the bank, attracting Japanese fire. Sun Li-ren was hit, but he was amongst the fortunate. Later, soldiers from the Tax Police Division would find him beneath a pile of dead bodies, with doctors later discovering 13 bullet wounds in his body. His participation in the Battle of Shanghai had come to an end. According to German advisors, the Chinese repeatedly made the same mistake in the struggle for the Sujo Creek. A lack of independent thinking amongst junior Chinese commanders prevented them from reacting aggressively to the Japanese crossings. This delay allowed the Japanese to entrench themselves, and subsequently, Chinese counterattacks often succeeded only after several costly failures. Moreover, Chinese artillery lacked the flexibility to adapt quickly and lacked training in selecting the appropriate ordnance for the situation. The Germans argued that this allowed the enemy sufficient time to set up good defenses. And even when later Chinese attacks achieved some significant successes, they failed to completely annihilate the enemy forces that had crossed the creek. Conversely, the Japanese were also quite frustrated, particularly their commander, Matsue. Although the 9th Division had made some significant advances, the 3rd Division remained confined to a narrow strip of land south of the creek, thwarting hopes for a quick, decisive push southeast to trap the remaining troops in Shanghai and Pudong. On November the 3rd, the birthday of Emperor Meiji, who was instrumental in modernizing Japan, Matsue reflected on his initial hopes of celebrating as the conqueror of Shanghai. Instead, he found himself disappointed, writing, "Now we finally won a small piece of land south of the Sujo Creek, but south of Shanghai and all of Pudong remains in enemy hands. That the festival is happening under conditions such as these is a source of boundless humiliation." Japanese planners in Tokyo had been increasingly concerned that operations in the Shanghai area were not progressing as anticipated since the troop deployments began in August. Despite sending 3 additional divisions, the advances remained limited, prompting the Army General Staff to consider a more fundamental strategic shift in China. The core question revolved around whether to prioritize the northern campaign or the battles around Shanghai, as Japan lacked the resources to effectively pursue both simultaneously. In early October, Japanese officers concluded that addressing the situation in Shanghai must take precedence. A large reason for this decision rested on fears of a potential Soviet attack in the northeast before the new year. With so many divisions stuck in Shanghai, Manchukuo was quite vulnerable. They had to finish this quickly. On October the 9th, the Army General Staff established the 10th Army, specifically designed to shift the balance in Shanghai. This new force included the 6th Infantry Division, currently deployed in northern China, a brigade from the 5th Infantry Division, known as the Kunizaki Detachment, and the 18th and 114th Infantry Divisions from the home islands. Command of the 10th Army was entrusted to General Yanegawa Haisuke, a 58-year-old veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, who had recently retired but was recalled to service due to his suitability for the role. He had previously served as the military attaché in Beijing and as an instructor of the city's Army College. The 10th Army was to be landed behind Chinese lines. There were 2 possible landing sites, the south bank of the Yangtze River, where earlier landings had occurred in late August, or the northern bank of the Hongjo Bay. Hongjo Bay provided the element of surprise, thus it was easily selected. However, when reconnaissance was performed, the area was found to be heavily fortified with many terrain issues that would complicate logistics. Matsue expressed his concerns in his diary that day. "It would probably be easier if they landed on the banks of the Hongpu and Yangtze rivers. This plan gives me the impression of a bunch of young people at play." The 10th Army was set to land before dawn on November the 5th. The Kunizaki Detachment would lead the assault, capturing a stretch of coastline east of Jinshaowei in the middle of the night. This was to be followed up by the 6th Division, with the 18th Division on its right flank and the 114th Division on its left. All units were to advance briskly north of the Hongpu River and cross it. A major objective north of the river was the city of Songjiang, a key transportation hub for both rail and road. Ultimately, the goal was to link up with the Japanese units advancing south in the flat countryside west of Shanghai, to encircle as many Chinese soldiers as possible. Secrecy was vital for the 10th Army in its preparations. The commanders recalled an old saying, "If you want to cheat the enemy, first you must fool your own men." To mislead their forces before the embarkation of the 6th Division, they distributed maps of Qingdao, a northern Chinese port city, to create the illusion that this was the operation's target. This way, if any information was leaked, it would mislead the recipient. On November the 1st, the convoy carrying the 6th Division departed the waters off the Korean peninsula, heading south. The following day, it merged with another convoy transporting the 18th and 114th Divisions from Japan. Together, they formed a substantial fleet of nearly 200 vessels, necessitating heightened caution to avoid detection. Strict orders prohibited the use of lights, and radio silence was enforced at all times. As the ships neared Shanghai, they sailed in a wide arc offshore, only redirecting towards land when they were aligned with Hongjo Bay. Upon learning their true objective, the soldiers felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as they crowded the dark decks, catching sight of the vague silhouettes of the continent they were about to conquer. The advance unit, the Kunizaki Detachment, boarded its landing craft as planned at 3 a.m. on November the 5th, heading towards its designated section of the coastline. Meanwhile, the rest of the 10th Army waited anxiously aboard ships anchored 2 miles offshore. The silence from the shore indicated that the detachment had encountered no resistance, although the ongoing radio silence left uncertainty. Eventually, the detachment signaled with light projectors that the landing had gone as planned. With this confirmation, the soldiers of the second wave began their approach, The 10th Army had intended for the invasion force to move swiftly from the landing zone to secure the area before the Chinese could mount a counterattack. Each soldier was equipped with a week's supply of rice and as much ammunition as they could carry to avoid being hindered by lengthy supply trains. Mobility was essential. On the first day of the landing, the Chinese launched only 2 minor counterattacks. One occurred on the left flank, but failed to hinder the advance north, while the other on the right flank also had limited success, forcing the Chinese to retreat ahead of the advancing Japanese troops. By mid-morning on November the 5th, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers had successfully landed, and this number continued to rise rapidly. The urgency of the situation was evident, and only swift and decisive actions could offer the Chinese generals a chance to avert catastrophe. However, instead of mounting an all-out effort to push the Japanese back into the sea, they chose to play a waiting game. The consensus amongst the command center of the Third War Zone in Sujo during the early hours was that the landing forces were weak and intended to distract from a more critical operation planned for the near future. Enemy resistance was weak and sporadic, allowing the Japanese divisions to make rapid progress despite encountering natural obstacles along the route. By the evening of November the 5th, less than 24 hours after the initial unit landed, they had advanced 3 miles inland. Before noon the following day, they reached a ferry port on the Hongjo River, where a group of over 100 soldiers managed to cross, clearing the way for the continued push towards Siang. Meanwhile, the left flank of the Japanese landing forces engaged in more intense fighting for the first time, but still managed to gain some ground. The Japanese momentum appeared unstoppable. In desperation, the Chinese resorted to scorched earth tactics reminiscent of the Napoleonic Wars, similar to the earlier actions in Hongjo Bay. They destroyed every building and field, burned crops, killed livestock, and poisoned all the wells, leaving nothing for the victors. It was, of course, the local population that ultimately paid the price, witnessing their ancestral homes reduced to ashes. Once the Chinese command was convinced that the invasion of Hongjo Bay was a genuine main effort rather than a deceptive act, they redirected all available forces south to contain the escalating threat. However, the Chinese had very troops to spare. The Chinese dispatched a total of 7 divisions and 1 independent brigade to the landing area. While this force appears to be roughly twice the size of the Japanese, in reality it was much weaker. Many of these units had endured extended battles and they were not fully combat strength. They were sent south without adequate preparation. Their morale suffered due to the continuous stream of negative news from the front. Additionally, the same poor road network that hindered the Japanese slowed the Chinese reinforcements, resulting in many arriving far too late to influence the conflict significantly. Once the opportunity to push the Japanese back into the sea was lost, the next best option was to halt their advance at the Hongjo River. Although this was a significant natural barrier, there was no fortifications prepared along its banks. Compounding the issue, a large number of civilian vessels were left on the southern bank, providing the Japanese with a very easy means of crossing. Confronted with a steady stream of better equipped and better experienced Japanese soldiers, many Chinese defenders occasionally would just retreat without a fight. In response to the threat from the south, the Chinese commanders repeated a costly mistake from the previous crisis. They deployed newly arrived troops in Shanghai directly into the battle. This disregard for the exhausting conditions of those troops, who had just completed a very long trek from Henan province, left them ill-prepared for the effective engagement. The 107th, 108th Divisions, part of the 67th Army, had recently just arrived to Shanghai when they were ordered on November the 8th to move south to defend the strategic city of Siang, at least until November the 11th. Though the commanders may have had no other choice but to deploy the 67th, the outcome was predictable. Despite their efforts to hold Siang, the 2 divisions could not stand against the Japanese, and by November the 9th they began withdrawing from the nearly surrounded city. During the retreat, Army Commander Wu Keiren was assassinated by a group of plainclothes men. Whether these were Japanese soldiers or local traders hired for the task, it was never determined, making him the only general to lose his life in the entire Shanghai campaign. This setback rendered the 67th Army ineffective as a fighting force, leading to a complete retreat from the battlefield. Like many other lower-quality units in the Chinese military, the rank-and-file soldiers had never been encouraged to take the initiative, and the corps ultimately disintegrated after losing their commander. Amidst the chaos and confusion at the landing zone, many Chinese officers concluded that the battle for Shanghai was lost, and they focused on salvaging whatever equipment they could before it was too late. On the morning of November the 5th, 3 artillery batteries stationed along the north shore of Hongjo Bay attempted to resist the Japanese forces. As the Chinese front along Hongjo Bay collapsed, even a successful retreat could be seen as a modest victory. Chiang Kai-shek was on the brink of a nervous breakdown as the full scale of the Japanese landing at Hongjo Bay became evident. On the evening of November the 5th, he had over 20 anxious telephone conversations with Gu Jutong, asking repeatedly, "Is there a fight?" Gu Jutong confirmed, "The artillery is bombarding us heavily. There are airplanes and warships." That night, Chiang Kai-shek met with Jian Chang, and he appeared to accept that it was time to abandon positions south of Sujo Creek. However, political considerations prevented him from immediately communicating his decision to his commanders. He wished to see the Brussels conference get underway without having China appear defeated, and he seemed to hope to hold out until November the 13th, aiming for a minor propaganda victory by demonstrating that China had endured for at least 3 months. On the night of November the 8th, Chiang Kai-shek issued a fateful command to the Shanghai police chief, Tai Jianchun, instructing him to hold Nanxi while the rest of the army withdrew west, a directive that sounded basically like a suicide mission. When Tai refused, Chiang Kai-shek's response was quite swift. "Shoot him." Luckily, Tai would escape being shot. The Chinese retreat from Shanghai commenced in an orderly manner. At 10 a.m. on November the 9th, the last soldiers organized their march southwest past St. Ignatius Cathedral, where thousands of refugees waited, leaving the city they had defended for nearly 3 months. As they departed, they burned significant properties, including factories and coal yards, to deny the Japanese valuable resources. Amongst the structures targeted was the Toyota cotton mills, a prominent symbol of Japan's influence in the Yangtze Delta. Initially, the withdrawal seemed quite disciplined, reminiscent of earlier successful withdrawals that had surprised the Japanese. However, the situation quickly deteriorated as the Japanese pursued them relentlessly. By noon, they had secured the Hongqiao airfield, the site of earlier conflicts, and aimed to inflict maximum damage on the retreating Chinese army. Japanese planes launched attacks from carriers offshore, machine gunning the congested roads filled with retreating soldiers. Additionally, they bombed bridges and train stations, destroyed communication lines, and shelled already weakened transportation networks. With communications largely disrupted and scattered units receiving no coordination, chaos ensued. Soldiers became consumed by the instinct for personal survival, leading to a disorganized stampede as panic spread. Desperate to escape, many soldiers tried to access designated foreign zones. Some forced their way across checkpoints at gunpoint, while others disguised themselves as civilians to try and gain entry. A foreign correspondent observed a Chinese soldier throw away his rifle and jump into the polluted Sujo Creek, wading across in just his underwear to escape Japanese capture. Similarly, senior officers realized that rank would not protect them from Japanese retribution. General Yi Chao, retreating with his staff, donned peasant clothes after encountering an abandoned farmhouse, and was later captured by the advancing Japanese, who mistook him to be a common laborer. As the Japanese approached Nanxi, the mostly Chinese area of Shanghai, the situation grew quite dire. A group of individuals accused of spying for the Japanese were executed by firing squads in public view, sparking terror amongst onlookers. As the government prepared to evacuate, officials urged the remaining residents to continue resisting, warning against traitors. The swift retreat of the Chinese army shocked many Shanghai residents who had believed the city could withstand a siege indefinitely. As the city fell in just a few hectic days, thousands of desperate civilians, burdened with their belongings, flocked to the bridges leading to the French concession, pleading to be let in. However, they were met with hostility from French police, reinforced with tanks, who ordered them to turn back. When they resisted, local Chinese employees were forced to help drive them back, resulting in horrific scenes of violence. You can actually go on YouTube and find footage of this. I've used it for many videos. The New York Times correspondent Alan Abin reported how the crowd was ruthlessly beaten back, with some falling into the Sujo Creek, where many would drown amidst the chaos. Chinese resistance in Nanxi persisted as pockets of soldiers were determined to make conquest challenging for the Japanese. After 3 days of fighting, between 5,000 and 6,000 Chinese soldiers remained in Nanxi when the Japanese launched their final assault on the morning of November the 11th. They began a relentless artillery bombardment of the densely populated area. Foreign correspondents, including American journalist Edgar Snow, observed the battle from the French concessions across the Sujo Creek. Japanese tanks advanced cautiously through narrow streets, pausing to fire before retreating, while infantry moved carefully to avoid Chinese snipers hiding amongst the buildings. While most residents had fled, some civilians continued their daily lives amidst gunfire and explosions. An incident was reported where a group of Chinese were eating rice in a saipan when a machine gun opened fire, causing them to seek cover under the mat. The Japanese forces encountered familiar challenges as they advanced through Nanxi, struggling to set up pontoon bridges across the canals, which slowed their progress. In a last stand visible to onlookers in the French concession, the Chinese soldiers faced an unequal confrontation. The Japanese tanks fired upon them from only 60 yards away, and the defenders were subjected to intense air raids before being driven back. At a desperate moment, one Chinese soldier carried a wounded comrade across the Sujo Creek, dodging bullets, and received assistance from French guards. This encouraged more Chinese soldiers to cross into the French sector, surrendering their weapons to avoid certain death. They would become internees protected from the Japanese, although they felt betrayed by the circumstances that forced such a decision. Not all soldiers managed to escape in this manner. Some relocated to a new position closer to the southern edge of the French concession, near a water tower. This location offered even less protection than the previous one and quickly turned into a deadly zone. Realizing they were losing, the Chinese troops fled towards the French sector, abandoning their equipment and weapons as they scrambled over barbed wire. The French commander commended their bravery and assured them that they would not be returned to the Japanese. As the battle across the Sujo Creek drew to a close, victorious Japanese troops swept through the remaining unoccupied streets of the Chinese parts of Shanghai, eliminating the last pockets of resistance. Similar to previous encounters in Hongjo Bay, defenders attempted to set fire to buildings and leave little for the occupying army. Thick smoke billowed over the district, limiting visibility, so onlookers in the French concession relied on the sound to gauge the battle's progress. As gunfire waned, cheers of "Banzai" filled the air. At 3:34 p.m., the rising sun flag was raised over the last Chinese stronghold in Nanxi, officially marking the end of the Battle of Shanghai. In a city ravaged by war, the district of Hongjo Bay became the epicenter of destruction, resembling bleak lunar landscapes. The area around the North train station was devastated, with gutted buildings standing like rugged cliffs and the asphalt roads marred by deep fissures resembling earthquake damage. As Chinese officials prepared to leave Shanghai for Nanjing, they tried to present a positive narrative of the battle, emphasizing the sacrifices made were not in vain. Mayor Yu proclaimed that the lessons learned in Shanghai during the past 90 days could benefit the entire nation in the war against Japan, instilling confidence in the people that victory would eventually come. He spoke as if the war was over in Shanghai, which was true in a sense, as the major conflict had concluded. In late 1937, the Japanese believed that they had achieved victory. On December the 3rd, Matsue's army held a victory parade through the unoccupied international settlement, a right they claimed as one of the governing powers there. It was a serious miscalculation. Japanese civilians and ronin were recruited to act as rallying crowds waving national flags, which triggered confrontations with foreign residents. The parade passed the Great World Amusement Center, where hundreds had died during Black Saturday, prompting a Chinese man to leap from a building, declaring "Long live China" as he fell. As the parade continued down Nanjing Road, tensions grew amongst the accompanying police. Suddenly, a grenade was thrown from a window, injuring 4 Japanese soldiers and 1 British police officer. Matsue's veterans fanned out to apprehend the assailant, but it was a Chinese police officer who would shoot him dead. What was meant to be a triumph turned into a fiasco. That confirmed the Japanese would struggle to secure even a small corner of China, let alone the vast territory of the country as a whole. The Battle for Shanghai became the bloodiest international conflict in Asia since the Russo-Japanese War. By late October, the Japanese estimated that China had suffered 250,000 military losses in the fight for the city. In the months following the battle, Chinese sources reported casualties ranging from 187,000 to as high as 300,000. Regarding the exact figure, the aftermath of the battle was catastrophic, severely impacting Chiang Kai-shek's best German-trained divisions. China faced a blow from which she would not recover until 1944, aided significantly by the Americans. The extremely high casualty rates stemmed from several factors. Many Chinese soldiers entered the battle expecting to sacrifice their lives, which led to a higher incidence of fatality due to their willingness to launch suicidal attacks against heavily fortified positions. Chinese tactics, which relied on numerical superiority to counter Japan's material advantages, essentially turned the conflict into a struggle of manpower against machinery. While this approach had a grim logic, it starkly contrasted with the reluctance of Chinese commanders to sacrifice valuable imported equipment. They were quick to expend their best divisions in intense fighting, yet hesitated to utilize their key weaponry for fear of Japanese air raids. The elite 87th and 88th divisions faced near depletion within days, while the Pudong artillery operated minimally over 3 months to avoid drawing enemy attention. One might question what Chiang Kai-shek achieved from such immense sacrifices. If his primary goal was to divert Japanese forces from the north, where they enjoyed easy victories, then the Battle of Shanghai could be viewed as a success. As autumn of 1937 progressed, Japanese commanders were increasingly forced to redirect their focus and resources to the more complex and tactically challenging terrain around Shanghai, where their technical superiority was less effective than on the northern plains. However, shifting the war to central China also posed risks, threatening the economic hub and political capital of Nanjing, ultimately resulting in a Japanese occupation that would last nearly 8 years. If Chiang Kai-shek wished to attract foreign attention, it is unclear how successful he actually was. The battle unfolded in front of thousands in the international settlement and the French concession, and garnered international media coverage, with many foreign correspondents arriving to report on the conflict. For 3 months, Shanghai dominated the front pages of major newspapers, and the Chinese effectively utilized propaganda to highlight events such as the desperate lost battalions fight in Hongjo Bay. Yet, none of the major powers felt compelled to offer substantial support to China, and even the Brussels Conference failed to provide any useful assistance. Both Western powers and the Soviet Union were closely watching the conflict. Chiang Kai-shek hoped for Soviet support, and historical records suggest that Soviet diplomats encouraged him with vague assurances. China aimed to provoke Soviet entry into the war against Japan. However, the outcome may have been counterproductive. By engaging Japan, China effectively diminished the likelihood of a Japanese assault upon the Soviet Union, as Japan needed to subdue China first. The Soviets eventually started providing material aid, including the arrival of nearly 300 Russian attack and bomber aircraft in mid-October, but this assistance was a poor substitute for genuine alliance. Additionally, while the Soviet Union emerged as a hesitant partner for China, China lost substantial support it had previously received from Germany. The Germans played a crucial role in Shanghai during 1937, with every major Chinese unit having at least one German advisor. Chiang Kai-shek's strategic decision to make a stand in Shanghai appears to have been significantly influenced by General Falkenhayn's opinions. Chiang had initially welcomed the German proposal to fight for Shanghai, and he was resolved to see it through, regardless of the cost to his troops. But by 1938, German advisors began departing China, coinciding with the outbreak of war in Europe. Unfortunately, their experiences in China did not translate into lessons for their future military engagements, particularly regarding urban warfare, which might have been beneficial in battles such as Stalingrad during the winter of 1942 to 1943. Instead, they returned to more conventional military roles in Europe. Despite enduring the most suffering in and around Shanghai during 1937, the battle proved to be far more costly for the Japanese than their commanders had anticipated. By November the 8th, Japanese military casualties totaled 9,115 dead and 31,257 injured. Although the Japanese forces enjoyed overwhelming advantages in artillery and air power, they could not compensate for their leaders' consistent underestimation of Chinese resilience and fighting spirit. The flow of reinforcements was disorganized, leading General Matsue and his commanders to feel they never had enough troops to achieve a swift and decisive victory. As the Shanghai battle neared its conclusion, Matsue became increasingly confident that he could inflict a blow on Chiang Kai-shek from which he would never recover. In an interview with a German reporter in late October, Matsue stated that after capturing Shanghai, the Japanese army would march on Nanjing if necessary. Matsue had a keen political sense, and he believed it better to act independently than wait for orders from Tokyo, declaring, "Everything that is happening here is taking place under my entire responsibility." Without an aggressive general like Matsue, it's questionable whether the Japanese would have proceeded to Nanjing or not. Initially, they focused on pursuing retreating Chinese forces, a sound tactical decision that did not imply an expansive strategy to advance to Nanjing. However, after another surprise amphibious landing on November the 13th on the southern bank of the Yangtze River, the Japanese commanders felt positioned to push for Nanjing, to bring the war to a conclusive end. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kingston Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kingston Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/KingstonGenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Thus, with that, the Battle for Shanghai, known to some in China as its Stalingrad, had come to a brutal end. Chiang Kai-shek gambled the cream of his army to gain international sympathy for his nation. But had it worked? Japan was conquering the northeast, and now with Shanghai conquered, the path to Nanjing and unimaginable horror remained.